My name is Barry Cole, and I'm the president of the Cole Foundation. How can art change public opinion? How can activism lead to positive changes in government policies and priorities? The Cole Foundation acknowledges the role of Indigenous people in shaping the Canadian society and indeed the worldwide society in the 21st century. We are proud to support this conversation today.
Oni Kinawea, Bindegan, Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival, Onquadance Indigenous, meanwhile, Joganoshman Nuswan, Duncan McCue, Maingan Nedo Dem, Anishinaabe and Dow. Welcome everyone to the Blue Met Literary Festival. My name is Duncan McCue. I am Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of Georgina Island, and I am very pleased to be your MC this evening for this remarkable panel that we've got on. We've got a great panel about looking at some of the theme of this year's festival, which is the challenges of our times. And the panel that we've got is on art and activism. And we've got some extraordinary Indigenous authors joining us this evening. And so I want to introduce them all. Kim Scott is an award-winning novelist who lives in Australia of Noongar descent. And his most recent novel is Taboo. It's good to have you, Kim. Gregory Schofield is an award-winning poet and author living in Canada, Red River Métis of Cree, Scottish, and European descent. His most recent work of poetry is Witness I Am. Hi, Greg.
Thanks.
And Devon Mihesuah is an award-winning historian and author in the United States and an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation. Her most recent work is as an editor of a collection called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the U.S. Hi, Devon.
Hello.
So the theme of this year's festival is challenges of our times, and I had a chance to converse with our panel about something that's been quite a hot topic here in Canada this past year, which has been the issue of identity and how we define indigeneity. And it's been spurred by some of the controversy that's been surrounding filmmaker in Canada here, Michelle Latimer. So our panel agreed that it would be timely to talk about pretendians. I'll put that in quotation marks. How we define Indigenous identity, the challenges that poses in the book world. And of course, we can't ignore the reckoning that's been happening throughout this past tumultuous year with regard to Black Lives Matter and how that has been playing out in each of our countries' literary worlds. So that's going to be the tricky territory that we're going to try to navigate today as respectfully as we can. But it's an important conversation for Indigenous folks, not just here in Canada, but right around the world. And so I want to start off with not a simple question, but to get us started on this conversation about how are false claims of Indigenous identity impacting Indigenous communities. And we'll just get a check-in with each of the authors here to see what they say about that question. Gregory, since you're in Canada, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks. Once again, it's nice to be here, and just want to acknowledge Duncan, you and the other panelists that I'm on with tonight. So your question, I think one of the big issues with the identity issue that's happening specifically in Canada right now, and specifically around Indigenous identity, and with people coming forward with kind of nefarious claims to identity, especially Indigenous identity. I think what's happening is that a lot of people who haven't done their due diligence, a lot of people who aren't connected necessarily to community, and I'm not just talking kind of an urban community, I'm talking about, community of origin. So for, people who aren't necessarily connected to community of origin and people who, might be looking into their family background, trying to kind of corroborate stories that they've been told or what have you. People, going on that journey and people starting that process, which I think is important. Is the issue is that people who have started that process or people who are engaged in that process will suddenly become spokespeople. They will suddenly start, there's been this kind of terminology that's been happening about, kind of people taking up oxygen in the room. There are a number of established Indigenous voices in this country, in Canada, not only within the literary world, but also, of course, within the arts community, within the film community, within the writing community, every kind of sector of the arts. And I think what happens is that people who are not sure, first of all, about their Indigenous connections to community or to place or to families, what happens is that people are given the opportunity to speak. And what happens is that they end up speaking for entire communities that they really know nothing about. So in a way, it's almost kind of like infiltrating into those communities and kind of using all of these things to substantiate what they're doing as far as their own work goes. So that poses a really, really big problem, not only for established artists, but established Indigenous scholars and academics. That causes huge problems far and wide.
I want to dig down into some of those problems a little bit later in the panel, but Devon, can I get your sense of how this issue of false identity claims is playing out in the U.S.?
Yeah, these pretendians are taking the places of legitimate voices, and often audiences don't know the difference between somebody who is, say, an enrolled citizen of a federally recognized tribe and somebody who is fooling. And one thing I wanted to mention or talk about here very quickly is the term descendant. I got my PhD 30 years ago and was a graduate student prior to that. And I never heard that term descendant except as it related to somebody who maybe could not meet their blood quantum requirement and could not enroll in a tribe. So they really truly are native. They just couldn't enroll. And maybe somebody who enrolled in a tribe but were disenrolled. And we often see that with very wealthy casino tribes. When a tribal council comes in, am I breaking up? I feel like I'm slow somehow. So when a new tribal council comes in, they want more money for fewer people. So then they start whacking people. So there are truly people who are of native blood who are descendants. But this term has exploded in the last 8 or so years because I had never really heard it up until then. So I just wanted to point that out. But many of these pretendians, they insert themselves into their scholarly work, their poems, and their novels. And they write us and we as if they possess some kind of inherent knowledge that nobody else has to the topic. And they include their fraudulent familial or tribal connections as if they are integral to that historical or cultural study. And by doing that, they've created fraudulent work. And, I wanted to point out that it would be very odd somebody to come in and try to write, an outsider to write taboo, for example, or thunder through my veins. You have to have those lived experiences, knowledge of the area, the history. You are the ones who are bringing this sort of rich knowledge and backstory, personal experiences, to this. I also wanted to point out Jacqueline Keeler's new book that has just recently come out, Standoff, about Standing Rock and the Bundys. And she's able to mesh her family stories into these topics because her tribe and her family lived in these areas. So, she is very successful because that is a legitimate voice. But what we are seeing in so many works these days in novels and poems are people, who are just putting themselves out there as if, they have these lived experiences but really they have these false backgrounds, and people are being deceived, essentially.
Devon mentioned both Gregory's book, Thunder Through My Veins, and Kim's book, Taboo. I want to ask about the books in a second, because of course this is a literary chat, but if I could just throw it, I'm curious to know if this is an issue that's playing out in Australia amongst Indigenous folks, false identity claims at all, Kim, in the arts world.
Yes, for the last couple of decades, I would think. And it's a curious thing, it seems to me, from my perspective. We are moving from a long time of denigration and attempted destruction of a heritage and of individual and collective identity. And probably because of the concerns of a settler colony to do with identity and belonging, we're moving, at least in enlightened circles, towards something like celebration of Indigenous heritage, the nation. And this is what's so hurtful about the pretendians, first time I've used that term, is many of us are still recovering and attempting to heal and working out our connection to that pre-colonial heritage, consolidating it at a community level. And then you get the glib hucksters moving in and contributing to sort of reduction of the possibilities for articulating what it means to be descended from those that first created human society in this part of the planet. And I think that's hurtful because of the trauma and crisis that many of us still live in, certainly in communities, is characterised by. And it's destructive in that it tends to favour polemical lines and people wanting to use the existing discourses tend to be polemical. It tends to be reductionist, and they demonstrate their authenticity through often, and it seems to be attractive to the mainstream, either some sort of angry voice, a conveniently angry voice, or being some sort of apologist. And so that's appealing to a non-Indigenous audience quite often, wanting to be appeased. So I think it's that you started, I think, by asking about the impact on one's own community. And I think it's that hurt and that diminishing of possibilities for how we might articulate who we are, and as a way to, many of us return to that pre-colonial heritage, that classical heritage, try and consolidate it in community seems to be effective, and to use that to gather some momentum into some sort of possible future in which we are more powerful and stronger, better able to contribute, really. And so often the pretendians, those convenient lines they run, the already known story, picking away at what are already quite shabby sort of narratives, I think. And we haven't got an internal, this might be different, we haven't got an internal community dialogue about those who didn't want to know community because of the harsh, punitive legislation and the shame that many of us were educated into. Those difficult apartheid-like times when you were punished severely for mixing with community, sometimes for mixing with family. And we haven't had an internal dialogue, and that needs to be at a community level, talking about that. So I would argue, so we can bring people back into the fold and build it rather than putting up heavy boundaries. And those pretendians tend to exacerbate factional or internal tensions about identity and what it means to be Noongar, in my case, in this part of the world.
There's so many good points there, Kim, and it reminds me of the song "Where Were You When?" We needed you, my friend. That came out in the 60s and 70s. I think one of the reasons this is a really difficult conversation for so many of us is that we have all had to deal with identity issues in one way or another. And I wonder if I could just walk through some of your works and talk about that. I mean, Gregory, your biography, "Thunder Through My Veins," is very much about. It revolves around your search for identity. Can you talk about why it's difficult for us to have this conversation, given those kinds of journeys that you've been on?
It's a great question, Duncan, and I'm glad you asked it because it's an important question. I think for so many Indigenous people in Canada and really throughout North America, there has been a disconnection for so many of us, and that has been a generational disconnection, that has been, family disconnection for, a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons Kim has touched on, reasons of shame, reasons of, family secrecy, colonization, various different reasons for people being disconnected culturally, spiritually, emotionally, and from community. So, I think that identity, first of all, is a very nuanced thing. Identity is very nuanced. And although there might, be similar histories that as Indigenous people that we share within this country, and across Turtle Island, each of those families are coming to identity. Each of those generations are coming to that issue of identity or lost identity through their own stories and through those own kind of nuanced things that have shaped that family. So, part of the thing that I've been really conscious about, especially with this whole debate around identity, and looking at my own experiences with identity and searching and, finding community and going home and connecting with elders and talking to people and collecting family stories and knowing where I come from, I'm really conscious of the fact that not everybody within our communities that have been disconnected have that opportunity. Not everybody has a community to go home to. Not everybody has elders that carry their family stories. We talk about our oral histories, which are so incredibly important. It's like those elders are the ones that know those family stories. Those elders in the communities are the ones that know how families are connected and know how people belong to that place. Because really, I think one of the big things that we're talking about here is we're talking about community, and we're talking about, people, and we're asking people, specifically within the Indigenous arts community, we're asking people to get connected with community before they start identifying, as Métis or as Anishinaabe or as, Nihio or whatever. We're asking people, we're actually requiring people to get connected with community. It's not about who you claim. Yes, it is part of who you claim, but it's about who claims you. That is really, really important. So, I realized that not everybody has the opportunity that I had insofar as going home and reconnecting and putting all of those, pieces of the puzzle together and, having a place to call home and having a history, having a culture, having a language. So I'm very conscious about the people that are on that journey and the people that are taking that journey. And, one of the things that I see a lot happening, which really is very, very hurtful, is so much lateral violence happening right now within our communities and people who are genuinely, and, I'm not talking about pretend Indians. I'm not talking about people who are claiming an identity or a history that doesn't belong to them. I'm talking about legitimate people who who have been disconnected through no fault of their own. And, I operate, I was fortunate to learn Cree from an adopted auntie at a very young age. I was very fortunate to be able to carry a lot of those cultural things that shaped me as a Métis person, specifically as a Mihesuah Métis person, as a Cree Métis person. And I really operate, so much of what I do is based around the idea of Wakotowin, which in Cree, Wakotowin is really, it's how we are related, how we are all related to one another, how we're related to not only, the plants and the animals and, all of the things, that have been created for us, but Wakotowin, how we're all related as relatives. And, I try to kind of operate on the premise of trying to be a good relative. Mm-hmm. And for me, being a good relative, knowing the journey that I've gone through, being a good relative is wanting to help other people on that journey too, and not make their journey a bad journey. Because there's a lot of people that don't operate on that premise, and there's a lot of people that are really contributing to what I'm seeing as the perpetuation of this colonial violence on one another. It's determining who is Indian enough, determining who is allowed to be Indigenous, who is not allowed to be Indigenous. Those conversations are really important, and as community people from our respective communities, we need to determine who our community members are. We need to know who our people are. Yet at the same time, we also need to be able to be good relatives, and we need to be able to help people on that journey home.
You raised a good point about the community claiming you back, and that being an important aspect of this. Kim, if I could ask you about Tavu. I mean, on the one hand, it's about reconciliation, but as an Indigenous reader, I very much identified with Tilly, your main character, who is half Indigenous, half white, and her journey. It is very much a connection back for her to her community, and I wonder why you chose to make Tilly the main character, and what aspects of her identity were part of that storyline for you.
Probably relates to some of the things we're talking about here. I think there's certainly, it works for one of the things that bothers me as a writer is the minority of my own people, those with whom I identify, who are readers. And so you're writing for a non-Indigenous audience a lot of the time. So I wanted to do that to model some sort of doorway into an Indigenous world as represented into a book. And to make that point of, like Greg's words there were very wise and compassionate, to try and make the same sort of point as some of what we were just listening to. The importance of being claimed, the importance of family, the importance of country and ancestral lands. And that sort of connection has been partly like family as well, with that sense of belonging. So I wanted very much to model that, and also recovering from near extinction in terms of historical processes. So it talks about the killing, it talks about the shame, it talks about the oppression, and that is what's diminished her as an individual, dwindled her. And the mix-ups in returning or forming a sense of identity, some of the glib lines that are around. In that novel, there's someone who's appointed as, supporting Indigenous students, and who is an idiot, a want-to-be, and is just parroting stereotypical and destructive lines that are available in the mainstream discourse to try and help Tilly articulate her sense of identity. So they're ambushes and traps, I suppose. So yes, in presenting Tilly like that, and also in my lifetime has been one of orbiting back into community, I think. I'm in my 60s. It wasn't until late 1960s that Aboriginal people in Australia gained citizenship. And I come from a history characterised by massacre and near destruction. So I like to, with Tilly, I'm modelling that business of trying to be proud and stand alone, but to go back to community in the interests of expanding a sense of self and expanding who one's community is, and moving out of, I used her as a character because it's moving out of disempowerment and diminishment. What are those processes? And they are, as we've just been hearing, reconnecting with people, being claimed. The process of reconnecting with language, I don't like that to be the only marker, because in the community I know, even reconnecting with ancestral language can be used as a tool in the lateral violence states that we're just hearing of, which is, it's an awkward thing to be able to articulate, but that's how damaged many of us are, and in terms of identity. And we define very much, the people I know anyway, very much by oppression and being marginalised. Tilly doesn't start like that because she's been assimilated, if you like, but comes to realise what else she needs, and her community need her as well. So yeah, they're the sort of reasons I was there's other things. That's why I was trying to work with Tilly.
Well, one of the wonderful things about the book is that the community does need her, and very much needs her, and that's that. I don't want to give away the ending, but I mean that becomes an important part of the book. You may have used pretendian for the first time, Kim, but I'll pick out a phrase that you use. Wannabe is a term that we use here as well. So one of the wonderful things about us, gathering here as Indigenous authors from around the world, Devon, when we talk about our works here, I know you've done an awful lot of work with the Cherokee. I mean, your vast corpus, actually, but your most recent work about Ned Christie and others, and the Cherokee, because of their difficult, challenging history, have had to deal with these false identity claims for a really long time. Can you, has that worked into your work at all in any way?
I can talk about my tribe.
Yeah.
I'm really not comfortable talking about, other tribes. I mean, there are Cherokees who can do that. I think, kind of bouncing off of what the other two have said, all the different things that I have written about, if I may go off in this direction, from boarding schools and repatriation and violence, racism, food and health, everything that I write about has great personal meaning to me. There's a lot of sweat and tears that go into this. And it wasn't until that I wrote my first novel, Roads of My Relations, when I was 40, because I didn't think I could write a novel, but I ended up doing it. And it was based off my family story. So it was multiple generations of, my family stories. And the centerpiece of this novel was, survival, but it was how the family garden kind of survived from this horrendous removal from the southeast part of the United States, courtesy of Andrew Jackson's removal policy, to Indian Territory. And this garden has survived. And so the gardens that I have are modeled after what my grandparents had. So, it's telling these stories that, I couldn't do that with nonfiction. I had to do that with fiction. But in a way, but it's nonfiction, if that makes sense. That would not really have been accepted, I think, in my nonfiction books as well. And then I had to backtrack a little bit. In 2010, I wrote Choctaw Crime and Punishment, which was about an ancestor who was a very prominent politician, was a traditionalist who was killed by rival members of a political party. And this caused a very big stink. But the reason that I mention this is because y'all were talking about community. And in this book, I really do expose, intratribal factionalism, and how our tribe has an extremely violent history between those people who accepted, the white interlopers who came in, the Choctaws who accepted Christianity. They became very acquisitive. They were more interested in wealth than they were with community. And so in writing this book, I realized that, I'm writing it for the traditionalists of my tribe, but it's not something that a good many of my tribe wants to hear about. They want the world to know that we were all just happy and held hands all the time. And that simply was not the case. So it becomes kind of difficult because my tribe right now is incredibly fractured. You've got your traditionalists and you've got the progressives. And our tribal council just a few years ago passed a resolution without even going for a vote saying that our tribe is a Christian tribe. They made this a resolution. And as you might imagine, the full-blood traditionalists were beside themselves. I mean, they had no say in this. So it was a very odd, strange thing to do. So, community, yeah, it's important, but I think there's different communities within a larger community, I guess. And so that makes it kind of difficult sometimes.
So there's two kind of prongs that you've all spoken about that I want to dig a little deeper into. One is how the literary establishment deals with claims of indigeneity, but also you've all kind of mentioned lateral violence, and so I wonder, Greg, if I could ask you, I mean, how should we deal with identity policing, if I call it that? And did I just lose Greg? I may have. Devon, maybe if I could throw that question out to you then, and we'll wait for Greg.
Oh, yeah, you did. You asked that question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, identity policing, it's very complicated because there's several ways that you can look at this. Some of the problems include the whistleblowers are the ones who really catch the brunt of this. Retaliation, rumors. One of the first things out of the mouths of people that are accused of being a pretendian is, I'm going to sue. Well, most of the time that's fine, because if you do go to court, you're going to have to produce your documentation. Usually they can't. But in the meantime, they come up with all kinds of gossip and they try to turn it back on you, and they want you to prove, that you are who you say you are, that kind of thing. And often those people who are in charge of this backlash are pretendians. And often they have a lot of people supporting them. So it makes it very, very difficult. And these people serve as gatekeepers. They serve as gatekeepers. They lash out at people who challenge their claim. And I can tell you about where I am at University of Kansas. You didn't want to name names, but everybody knows about KU. If you don't, just look it up right now. But the professors who claim to be pretendians there tend to be very easy on their students because they need to cultivate a following, because that legitimizes them. And in doing that, they can point the finger at maybe Native professors with higher standards, and they can call them racist and anti-Indians. And students who may not know any better, they follow along with this. I mean, this is a real honest to goodness problem, and this is one of the reasons why Indigenous studies kind of fell apart. But also in regards to policing, I think it is important to mention that there's also this other issue of Indians who try to out-Indian other Indians. If that makes sense. Yeah, they really do. And so they try to do this on basis of maybe skin, hair, and eye color. Are you from the res? Are you traditional? Whatever that means, I guess. And your cultural knowledge. But on the other hand, while that can be really annoying and tiresome, I think that's also very, those are important questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are important questions to ask because among the Cherokees that you asked me about, I will say this. Cherokees, you only have to prove descendancy of somebody who's on the Dawes roll that closed in the early 1900s. And there are some Cherokees who are only 4,096 degree Cherokee blood.
Mm.
Okay. So if you look phenotypically white, you're not going to have the same challenges as, say, a full blood who has to contend with racism because they look like a minority. So I think it is a very fair question to even ask people, we're talking about, policing. I think it's a very fair question to ask people, what is your cultural knowledge? What is your community connection, even though you might actually be of that tribal blood?
Kim, I saw you nodding through a couple of times when Devon was speaking there.
Oh, look, I'm enjoying listening to everyone, to tell you the truth. And then I was nodding, and I was feeling almost weepy. I was thinking about the lateral violence and the questioning, and as we've just heard, and the need for it. If people, you need to be we need to be accountable, all of us. That means we need to be challenged. We need to recognise the enormous oppression and pain that many of our people carry, and recognising that often hurt people. And I know that my community has members that are their own trauma makes it difficult for them to be compassionate and good relatives, as we heard earlier, good members of the family. And they want to be, hurt people. How we deal with this, all I can think is some of the lines we deliver to non-Indigenous people about the need for truth-telling, about the need for recognising our history. We need opportunities, it seems to me, to do that ourselves collectively, to work through some of these, what we were just hearing. You're more Indian, to use your expressions. Mm-hmm. You're more, I'm more Indian than you, and what does that mean? And if oppression is a major defining characteristic, which it may be, what about the damage that's come through oppression as well? How does that contribute to us turning on one another like this? Our history, how does that contribute to us sometimes wanting to draw a firm line between who's in and who's out? How does our history contribute to our anger and the pain we feel about pretendians being lauded by large numbers of people when their experience doesn't speak to us? Mm. That's why I was nodding, just recognising truths in some of what I was listening to, and trying to correlate it with the difficulty of answering some of these issues. How do we deal with identity policing? I can only think through stories and truth.
It's such a powerful line. Hurt people that you just said, Kim. I have to say that's making me think. Just as I'm listening to you all speak, Greg, it's really common for us to ask. One of the first things when we meet someone from communities is where you're from. Where are you from? Basically wanting to know who your mom is in many ways. But do we need to formalize that somehow? Or is that going too far?
I think that great question, Duncan. I think what you're talking about is you're talking about our protocols. Mm-hmm. You're talking about that this has gone on since time immemorial. In Cree, you say "Tantu Ochikia," where are you from? Mm-hmm. Who is your mom and who is your dad? Mm-hmm. It is our way of placing each other in our geographies. And it's a way of knowing, first of all, if we're related and how we're related, but it's also to know about what territories we're coming from. What is the territory that we come from? What is the communities that we come from? And when you think about colonial violence, and I'm speaking really specifically about residential schools and the whole disruption of our traditional forms of governance and all of those things that were disrupted through residential schools. Generations were leaving those schools not knowing where they were from, not knowing who they were related to. So it is excruciatingly important when we are introduced to one another, when we are learning about one another. People will always say, "Danto Chikia, where are you from? What community are you from?" And inevitably, you'll always get people saying, "Oh, well, I'm related to so-and-so, or I know so-and-so." So really, it is our way of locating one another. It's our way of acknowledging not only who we are, but acknowledging who our families are, and acknowledging our geographies, like acknowledging our territories. So I kind of cut out when I think the second question was being asked with poor Wi-Fi here. So sorry, but I was listening and I was understanding that some of the question was about policing.
Yes.
So it's important, I think, kind of going forward, especially now when people are really looking at identity. And I'm going to go back to what I was saying about identity earlier, and about that being a really nuanced journey for a lot of people, and that being a journey that I think that it's really important that we support one another, taking that journey, and also holding one another accountable as far as that journey goes. I'll give you a very quick example. When I was in a university class that I was teaching, I was dealing with a young student who was really very excited to take the class because he introduced himself as Métis. And when I further had a conversation with him and was asking him exactly where he was from and who he was related to, he told me that he was from Nova Scotia and that he didn't really know who his family were or his people were. And so we had this conversation about, Nova Scotia being Mi'kmaq territory, and that, if he had a connection to an Indigenous community there, to be going to his grandparents, to be going, to family members, trying to get family names to reconnect him to that place and to that geography. And he thought that it was okay just to say he was Métis because he had mixed ancestry. And I explained it to him this way. I said, when you do that, you're not really honoring your ancestors. It's like if your ancestors are Mi'kmaq, you want to honor them. You want to honor the community that they come from. And that way going forward, when people, and once you've been accepted by that community, and once you know that your ancestors are tied to that community, then when people ask you, you don't have to say you're Métis. You can say, I'm Mi'kmaq. This is who I am. So, there are gentle ways, and I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There are gentle and there are kind ways to hold people accountable, to not only help them on that journey, but to hold people accountable. And I think that's what we need to start, really thinking about insofar as this idea of policing and lateral violence. I mean, all of these things, whenever I hear those terminologies, I completely go to this place of colonial violence and enacting colonial violence on one another, and how that is not helpful. Yet at the same time, I realize that it's imperative and it's really, really important that we start being able to not only help people, but to be able to hold people accountable as far as community of origin, who their families are, and what they're claiming to be.
So on that accountability point, then, Devon, maybe if I could ask you, I mean, it seems Gregory started off talking about the space that some folks who have false claims are taking up. They're taking up that space, taking up that oxygen, if you will. When it comes to publishers or literary awards or those kinds of things, I mean, what self-identity has been kind of the gold standard for a while now because of the disconnection that so many of us have experienced. Yeah. But what should these outside bodies, these non-Indigenous bodies, be doing when it comes to identifying who is Indigenous?
If a person claims to be of a tribe here in the United States, they should be able to prove it. And far and away, most of the people who claim to be Native here in the United States, they say they're Cherokee, or they might say they're Choctaw or even Chickasaw. And the irony of that is those are among the most well-documented tribes. And, I'm talking about just all kinds of ways that you could find your ancestors. And I'll give you an example. Okay, so I am Choctaw. And my family is found not only on the Dawes roll that closed in the early 20th century, but also on the 1830s removal rolls. The 19th century census records of Choctaw Nation districts and precincts, voter records, marriage licenses, brides lists, school rolls, House and Senate records, sheriff reports, court cases, and there were an awful lot of newspapers also in the Choctaw Nation. And I had an ancestor who signed the removal treaty. Granted, it was an X, but, his name was next to it. So, I didn't say that because I think everybody should be able to produce it. But if you're going to claim one of those tribes, you should be able to find something. And in particular, a lot of Cherokees, who I could name that really do work a lot in the pretendian issue, they really get very upset because they have to deal with this on a daily basis. And they say over and over again, there's so many places where your family could be. And if you can't find it, you're just not. And for the first book that I wrote, it was on the Cherokee Female Seminary. And I did another project on the male seminary. And I looked at over 5,000 students, and I spent 2 years doing nothing but demographics of looking at the Dawes rolls. And I used the old, microfilm, reel to reel, because we didn't have Ancestry.com, and which is
good old days.
The good old days, yes. And so this is why I have to wear glasses. And if I could not find somebody on the Dawes roll because perhaps they died before the rolls opened, I could find their child, or I could find a sibling. If I could not find a female somewhere, I could find the man they married. Then I could find, her married name. It is there. And so I really think, this is so complicated, and I don't want to run out your time, but honestly, you can't just take a person's word for it. And with publishing these days, I know you were going to talk about the Black Lives Movement, but publishers are really, in the United States, really wanting more and more Native authors, but they don't know who's Native. They just take your word for it. And this is really the problem that we are having. And if the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act was to expand and to include academics and novelists and poets, that might be a real deterrent, because if you are caught, creating jewelry and you claim that you are Native, we're talking 10 years in jail, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in fines. We need some kind of deterrent. And also in the academy, they don't ask for proof. All you have to do is self-identify, and that's good enough. And that's good enough for them. And if I can just give you one more example, and then I'm going to stop, is we have a person on our campus who is Comanche, and everybody knows who it is, so it is no secret. When I got there in 2005, he claimed to be a member of the Quahati band. And that means the antelope eaters of the Comanches. Well, my husband is Comanche, and his father is a full-blood and respected elder. And so this guy realized, I better not do that. So he changed bands. And so he decided to become a member of the honey eaters. And so what he continues to tell his students in class is, bees and wasps come to my mouth and they flit very gently and kiss me on my lips because I am a member of the honey eater band. So this is the kind of thing that, when you're telling your students these things, and students don't know any better, they're thinking, wow, that's really cool. This is why we have to have something in place, to deal with this sort of thing.
Kim, a deterrent? Does there need to be some kind of deterrent for people taking advantage?
I'm reluctant to say deterrent because of what we heard from Greg earlier on. You should know by now where I am, where I'm from, people should be able to work out their genealogies or have people claiming them, I think. At the same time, I want us to be big-hearted and compassionate and generous enough to be able to welcome people in, the family thing, or it's the whole survival and recovery narrative that's part of, and that deep compassion as against drawing a line and policing. But yeah, the constant danger is this continual belittling and reductionism that goes on about culturally who we are and our heritage. If we just accept anybody, if anybody's just accepted as a spokesperson and they'll speak, in my case, they'll speak for Noongar people. And much of the mainstream press and the publishing industry seems quite keen to hear that, particularly if it fits with their preconceptions of what Indigenous people should be saying. So yes, I'm enjoying listening to all of you. Thank you.
And I mean, I think that's part of it too. Is that there publishers seem keen to hear so-called good Indians, or Indians that, and I use that term, obviously. With my Canadian experience here, but the Indigenous folks that fit the narrative that's comfortable, and the folks that are pushing the boundaries, that are reclaiming Indigenous narrative, that are using Indigenous languages, all of those things that may not sell, be at the top of the bestseller list, they have a harder time getting in there. So Gregory, again, should there be some kind of method or gatekeeping that the publishers and literary awards need to be aware of in this conversation?
I think that there does. I think that I don't know exactly what that looks like. I've thought about it, and keeping in mind, it's like we're talking about a very kind of duplicitous issue. It's like there are so many sides of, kind of what we're talking about. I think once again, like it comes back to community, and community has to be able to determine that. I'll kind of circle back to Duncan, how you opened the panel tonight, talking about, the Michelle Latimer case.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous filmmakers need to be responsible for that. Indigenous filmmakers need to know who is in their community of writers and who they're working with and who is telling stories. One thing that I've always maintained, and I think it's really true, is that in a way, as artists, it's like, we're all writing our way out of colonization. We're all writing our way out of traumas, whether those are individual or family traumas, whether those are community traumas. And it's work that we're doing all together. I mean, it's work that is being done in film, in movies, in literature, in novels, in poetry books, in beautiful works of art and paintings. It's work that's being done in beadwork and in jig steps. So community needs to be responsible. It's Indigenous filmmakers need to have the say about who the artists are in their community. It's the same thing within the Indigenous writing community, is that we need to be able to know who our storytellers are. We need to know how they're connected. We need to know what community they're representing, what communities they're coming from. And I don't want to be really black and white in that, because again, I go back to this place of these very kind of nuanced experiences that people are bringing to their art, whether that is an urban Indigenous experience, whether that is, an experience of somebody who grew up on the res, whether that is somebody who's grown up in a Métis community. The bottom line is that, artists need to be able to bring their communities to that given artistic community. And we need to know who we're working with. We need to know who we're telling stories with. In the old days, from my understanding and what I've been taught, storytellers had one of the biggest responsibilities within the community. Not only were they storytellers, they were geologists, they were genealogists, they were historians. They knew families, they knew family histories, they knew geographies where people came from. So we need to, within our own evolving ways, are based upon traditional structures of governance, based upon contemporary norms that we're working toward. We need to be able to know who our community members are. And, we need to know who those storytellers are that are coming into our prospective communities, what they're doing with our stories, and how they're presenting our stories to a larger audience.
And such a good point about how we rely on each other as well. I mean, it's not just one person's false claims, but it ends up being a large group of people who can be affected by these. Our time is running short here, my friends, and I've enjoyed this conversation a great deal. You've given me all something to think about. I'll give you each about a minute to wrap up if you have any thoughts. Devon, perhaps.
Yeah, I do appreciate the thoughts about, reconciliation and trying to be welcoming. But in the United States, this problem has absolutely exploded. And this is purposeful behavior that is going on here. And it's just out of control. And some, people are so concerned about this, and we really don't know what to do. And tribes and communities need to be the ones to step forward, you're right, and say, this is, we claim this person, but sometimes they don't do it. And trying to make this a coordinated effort is just a Herculean challenge. And so that's what we're dealing with right now, so that the real Native people, their voices don't disappear. That's kind of what we're really concerned about right now.
Thanks. Kim?
Like all of you, I've enjoyed being part of this. Pretendians. Yes. I can see I think we're it's early stages, perhaps, with this. It's the business of people stealing stories from community and being celebrated for that. That's what's so painful. That's what's so painful about it. And so I can only say one needs to be accountable. I have some difficulties with the idea of community sanctioning or otherwise what one writes, because often I think some of my writing is trying to tear out some space in sort of mainstream discourses. And I fear, and I don't feel proud about this, it's just the way it is, sometimes my literary work is functioning as a cultural artifact. That is, my community members may not read it, certainly not the way I read it, but they see it going out into a wider world and being useful for that reason. And sometimes that can be, the work can be prickly and bristling in all sorts of ways. And that, in a way, is why I'm concerned about some of the aspects of pretendians, as we say, is offering up convenient narratives that fit, that don't unsettle the existing discourses, where we need to be expanding the possibilities for narrative and to speak about who we are. There's a Bolivian writer, I don't know if this will gel with the rest of you, Eduardo Galeano, who talks about how important it is, paraphrasing an essay of his, Why I Write or something. He says, how important it is that we follow in the footsteps of ancestors, and I concur with that, but that does not mean we adopt the costumes and curios that tourists expect of a defeated people. And I fear that sometimes pretendians are offering up that sort of easy fodder.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those wise words, Kim. Last word to you, Gregory.
Oh, I get the last word. First of all, to all of you for being on the panel. So much to think about, and so much of very rich conversation. I want to go back, I guess, just in my closing, just with talking about community, and just this idea that our stories belong in community. We're each a part of that community, and we all have responsibilities. So we have responsibilities as community members to tell our stories in as many different ways as we're going to tell them. Of course, we're not all telling, each, the same stories, but to honor our stories, to honor our communities, and to honor and to be able to help those people who legitimately are looking to find community and to make space for them, yet at the same time to be very cautious about who is coming into those spaces.
Jimmy Gwitch, thank you all for embarking on this conversation. It's a challenging one, but as Devon pointed out, it's a really critical one. I think and I think Indigenous authors need to lead this conversation. We can't sit back and wait for other people to be making these kinds of decisions for us. So thank you all for sharing your words and your thoughts and giving us some guidance on this. And for the folks that are watching right now, Miigwech Bazindayik, thank you so much for listening to us all. You can, of course, I hope that you will check out the bookstore that's associated with the Blue Metropolis Literary Festival and get a copy of Kim Scott's book and Devon Mihesuah's book. Did I get it right, Devon? Sorry.
Mihesuah.
Thank you, Mihesuah. Thank you very much. And Gregory Schofield's book. You can, of course, pick up their wonderful works, or just go to your local bookstore, even better, and support them as well. And thank you all for watching and joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's an honor, you guys.
Okay.
You too. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.